Hello. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about the history of the Hellenistic and Roman periods of the Holy Land. And I have here on the opening slide two different pictures. One is a mosaic, a very interesting mosaic that was uncovered recently at an excavation by the Sea of Galilee of a synagogue that was built in the 4th and 5th century called Hukuk. And there really are some really marvelous mosaics that are coming out of this archaeological excavation. But this is one of them. And it's been open to different interpretations, but the primary archaeologist of the site, Dr. Jody Magnus, claims that this is depicting the encounter between the high priest and Alexander the Great, an apocryphal story, but one that has a long tradition, which is really interesting if she's right about that. Because why would you find a story or recounting of this moment in history, of all the moments? Why would this be placed within a Jewish synagogue in the 4th and 5th century? And what we're going to look at a lot here is, in this discussion, in this lecture, is this encounter between Greek and Jewish society and culture. And we'll go down to the Roman period. And then I have a picture over here of Herod the Great, because, of course, he's a crucial figure within the biblical tradition of the New Testament, and also crucial towards the political history of that period of time of Jesus' ministry and what followed after his son's work during Jesus' ministry. So with that, let's begin by talking first about the Persians, just to remind ourselves that prior to the coming of the Greeks and Alexander's conquest of this area, the Persians, modern-day Iran, dominated this region, the ancient Near East, really from about 538 to 333 BCE. You could date that a couple times, maybe more typically is 332 because of a crucial battle. But just to give this sort of a round number of thinking about when the Persian Empire was the dominant empire of this region, and you can see the spread of that empire in the orange. It went all the way from India to Europe. It was beating the door on Greece, in fact, Greece felt threatened by Persia, and all the way down into Egypt. So really controlling the entirety of the whole ancient Near East. Alexander the Great took over for his father, who had unified the Macedonian city-states, sorry about that. And he built on the foundation to begin this conquest, this dramatic conquest. First time a European power becomes the dominant force within the ancient Near East. And you can see through the green the extent of his empire until his death in 323. So he died very young in terms of his own, only 33 years old. But he accomplished a lot in that very short period of time. Upon his death, his kingdom was divided into 3 parts amongst his generals. Technically 4, but we'll talk about 3. The Greek Empire, but then, of course, what really we're interested in is his general Ptolemy was given the area of Egypt and the area extending into Palestine or Israel or the Holy Land. So initially, the Ptolemaic, which since it was founded by this general Ptolemy, he became known as the Ptolemaic kingdom, was Israel was underneath the rule of the Ptolemaic. Judea was underneath the rule of the Ptolemaic Empire. To the north, just to the north of Ptolemaic Empire, was the Seleucus, or the Seleucid, or sometimes people will say the Seleucid Empire. You see a couple of different pronunciations there. Seleucid kingdom. They dominated this whole area that really included Persia and all the way into Turkey. And so once again we see, and we've talked about before, why the land of Israel was always sort of this fractal point between 2 kingdoms, because of this bottleneck that happened in terms of the Mediterranean Sea to the west and then desert to the east, so that basically there's a 70-mile strip of land that we call the Holy Land or Israel or Judah. really was the narthex that all the great empires had to travel through if they're trying to move to one of the great river civilizations or to the other continents. So, okay, so this is the starting point of the Hellenistic period. And as I mentioned, initially it was controlled by Ptolemy, who you can see a bust of him right there. And the Ptolemaic kingdom controlled the area of modern-day Israel until 198, basically. And their center of power was in Egypt and particularly in Alexandria. And then on the other side, we have the Seleucid king who comes to power, Antiochus III, also called Antiochus the Great. And he comes to power, as you can see from the dates there, and a couple of centuries after, a century and a half after the founding of the Greek Empire. And he goes to battle with the Ptolemaic kingdom and gains control of the area of Judea. And he really controls that area. The Seleucid or Seleucid kingdom controls that area for about 35 years. And their power base is in Syria and Damascus. Now, he himself passes away about 10 years after they've conquered this strip of land. But his grandson comes into power in 175, and he's a crucial figure in the whole history of the Jewish history, because Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and Epiphanes means God manifest, so he was making a claim of his divinity, which was uncommon for emperors to say they were a manifestation of God or even a son of God. But he comes to power, and even underneath the first Antiochus III, there had been encroachments upon Jewish sovereignty by the Seleucids. They had, for example, tried to take the money from the temple. Antiochus III had tried to do that. That was thwarted. But because of his own military campaigns, he was looking for cash and increased the taxation upon the Jewish population. And Antiochus IV just ratchets that up. He too is looking for money to support his campaigns. And he gets one interesting source of money, and that comes from Jason. Jason was the brother of the high priest Onias. And Jason comes to Antiochus and says, hey, I'll make a deal. Here's a bunch of cash. Make me the high priest and replace my brother. And I'll build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. I'll continue this process of Hellenization, which was one way the Greeks tried to maintain uniformity across their empire, is through their culture. And also, obviously there's a cash payment. I should make mention that the temple was a great source of revenue, not only because of sacrifices, but also oftentimes that's where tax money was also kept. Because temples were seen as locations where people would not attack, out of fear of God. And so you could almost say temples served a little bit like a modern day bank. So the high priest had a great access to resources. You could, if money's flowing in and out of the temple, whether that's temple money or other secular source money that's being kept there, there is opportunity for graft and for skimming things off the top and what have you. So this was a very lucrative position, being high priest, if you wanted to treat it as a source of revenue, which is why Jason probably was interested in it, and power. Now, that was not, looked upon favorably by a number of people. The fact that Jason has just gone into cahoots with Antiochus. But at least Jason was in a priestly family, right? The Zodiac traditional family that's supposed to be the priestly line that is to serve as high priest. But then along comes another person, Menelaus, who is not of the Zodiac line, and not of that high priest line, but he, having observed what Jason pulled off, he bribes Antiochus to become named high priest. So now we have a little bit of kerfuffle because Antiochus goes along with that, and now we have in the high priest role somebody who's not of the high priest line. And for faithful Jews, this is problematic. It ends up that a civil war breaks out between the forces loyal to Jason and Menelaus, as well as the Hasidim, translated as the pious ones. These Hasidims are trying to throw off all the shackles of Hellenism that they see as corrupting the faith. So they're coming at this from a different perspective than the two forces of Jason and Menelaus. Antiochus had gone down to Egypt to try to expand his control, by defeating the Ptolemies and pushing them back. He was unsuccessful. He was defeated. So it was probably in a sour mood as he returned back, going back up to Damascus into Syria. And he's passing through Judea. And here's this squabble in the civil war. So he intervenes and slaughters thousands of people. He plunders the temple and taking the money, and then also reinstates Menelaus as the high priest. So obviously a lot of bad blood's going on, and then it gets even worse because then to quell another uprising, Antiochus sends down one of his generals who, as part of his way of trying to quell the rebellion, goes into the temple. This is in 168, 167. And he erects a statue of Zeus and offers a pig. Right? So the injunctions against the consuming of pork, well, he even offers a pig as a sacrifice to Zeus in the temple grounds. Now, of course, the Seleucids, their perspective is, look, you should honor our God. We're in charge of you, so our God should be present within your religious system as a sign of your fidelity to us. But from the Jewish perspective, this was an abomination, a desecration. That just ratcheted up these feelings. Then there was an attempt, kind of what starts the major revolt is one of the armed officers of this force was going around to local towns to get the local leaders to indicate their submission to the Seleucid kingdom. And the way they did that was by bringing a statue of Zeus, and you had to offer a little sacrifice to Zeus, as a sign. Now, this was mainly meant to be a sign of your civic, commitment. This was not uncommon in the ancient Near East. You could honor your own gods, but you have to give honor to our gods. And since we're in charge, it's clear that this is our God's more powerful, and you should give him some sort of due. You could think about this today, maybe more secularly, in terms of taking a pledge of loyalty to a nation or whatever that's come and conquered another people, a loyalty oath of some kind like that. At least I think from the Greeks' perspective, that's what they were doing, although the mixture between religion and politics was much more intertwined, so it's hard to kind of pull this out. But it wasn't just a religious kind of a request. It was a civic request. Well, Matthias from the Hasmonean family, he's a priest, not, by the way, of the high priest line, though. He's not that kind of priest, but he's a local priest, and he refuses to offer the sacrifice. And he sees another Jew who decides to make the sacrifice. Well, he ends up killing that Jew and the officer as well. And he and his sons flee, and then they begin to lead a guerrilla warfare revolt movement. Basically, his son, he dies within a few months of the beginning of this revolt, and his 5 sons in succession end up taking up the mantle and leading this effort. The first one is Judas, who is called the Hammer. This is why we talk about this as the Maccabean Revolt, because he was very successful in terms of using guerrilla warfare, and recaptures Jerusalem in 164 BCE and rededicates the temple, cleanses it and rededicates it. This is actually where the religious holiday of Hanukkah, which I think many of us are familiar with within Jewish tradition, comes from. It's to celebrate the rededication of the temple. And then there's other brothers, but two I'll make mention of, is when Jonathan takes up the role of the leader of the movement, he actually gets named high priest. But again, here's a problem. The Hasmoneans are not of the high priestly line, as well as governor. He basically is, there's some autonomy here, but he's gotten, they're not totally free, but they have some autonomy, religious freedom for sure, but, sort of a quasi-independence from the Syrians. And then same thing when his next brother Simeon becomes the leader of the movement. He gets named high priest and also king. Again, this is more of at this point more of a client king, but there is some autonomy in terms of the control of the area. Really full independence, where the Hasmonean dynasty is not giving tribute or having some sort of negotiated independence or quasi-independence with the Seleucid Empire. Comes in 134 BCE when John Hyrcanus, he basically, this is once again an independent region. But we can talk about, basically the autonomy of Judea stretching from 168 to 63, as we'll see in a minute. So here's 68, 67 to 63. Okay, so the Maccabees, or the Hasmoneans, interchangeable terms, are now in charge. But there's a couple problems. One, they're not of the Davidic lineage, so are they legitimate kings? Right? If we read back in the Old Testament that the line is to come through David's line in terms of those who are to be king. And they're not part of the Zodiac lineage, so they're not part of the high priest line, and yet they have both those roles. Also, they took Greek names, and so, there's certainly in ways in which they had to navigate, even though they're trying to exert independence, still the dominant world power were the Greeks. And so there was a way in which they were always kind of navigating those policies, that politics. And for some Jews, they were not only illegitimate in terms of being kings or high priests, but also there's suspicion they weren't pure enough in terms of their Judaism, even though the rebellion started to try to give Jewish independence. There was a group called the Hasmoneans, the pious ones, who felt that the Maccabean Revolution and rulers were not faithful enough to their Jewish faith. And as I already kind of mentioned, since they had control of the temple funds, there was accusations that they abused those funds for their own political power. All right. So after John Hyrcanus, there were a couple different rulers and real tension in terms of holding this together. And in addition to this, the Roman Empire is starting to exert itself and to take over the Greco kingdom, the different Greek kingdoms. And so after one of the kings dies, there's a power struggle of who will take over. And both sides of the people who want to become king of Judea, both of the kings or contestants, appeal to Rome. This is in 66 BCE. Appeal to Rome to say, hey, can you come on my side, back my claim up, and I'll be a good Roman, subject to you. Well, Rome sees their chance to maybe not just provide some support, but actually gain control of this territory. Pompey arrives with his troops in 63 BCE, conquers the area, and they actually, initially, the land is put underneath the control or governance of the governor of Syria. Until Herod the Great. So Herod's father, who's an Edomite, so Edom is if you look at this map, you can see the Idumea, which is during the Roman period, the name for Edom. And if you read your Old Testament, there's tension between the Edomites and the people of Judea and Israel. They're enemies, even though they're close neighbors, and they recognize there's some ethnic connections, but there's still tension. And But anyway, Herod the Great's father was an official within Hyrcanus II, one of the descendants of Jonathan Hyrcanus, and was in his court. And he basically massaged it to get his son to be recognized as the governor of Galilee. And now, Herod the Great, his mother was Jewish, so he does have Jewish blood in him, even though his father is an Edomite or Edomian. He becomes governor of Galilee, and he's pretty successful as governor. I mean, we have pretty horrific perspective, we should, of Herod the Great, but one cannot doubt that he was an effective leader. He knew how to consolidate power. He knew how to achieve a number of impressive building projects. So there, his ruthlessness certainly was part of his value to the Romans, but because he was able to maintain control, which would obviously lead them to value his ability to keep control of the area. And so he was named in about 40 or 39, some dispute about the date, he's named the King of Judea by the Roman Senate. And he defeats his rival to this, Antiochus. If you know your Roman history, there was a moment when there was some question about who would become the next Roman emperor. Would it be Anthony or Augustus? Augustus ends up winning that. The only problem for Herod the Great is that he had backed Antony. Now, if you know the Antony and Cleopatra story, they're down in Egypt, so it makes some sense that Herod would have been on the Antony bandwagon, because they're literally next door versus Augustus, who's in Rome. But when Augustus defeats Anthony, this is a perilous moment for our friend here, Herod. So what does he do? He puts his wife and family and mother up in Masada, this cliff fortress, and then he flees to go to Rome to make his case to Augustus that he should be retained as the king of the area. And he's successful in that. He's very adroit in massaging the situation so that Augustus is, okay, you can stay as king. And we know him, of course, from the New Testament, because he is the king when Jesus is born. He's the king who slaughters the holy innocents, that tries to kill Jesus as an infant. So this is Herod the Great. Now, some people get confused because Herod dies after a couple years, right? We know that story from Matthew. He dies, so therefore Joseph brings the family back from Egypt to come back up to Nazareth to live. Yet we hear about Herods in the Gospels during Jesus' ministry. Well, they're not talking about Herod the Great later on during Jesus' ministry. They're talking about usually Herod Antipas, although sometimes they talk about Herod Philip. Now, here's Herod had more children than this, but these are kind of the key players I want to note. Herod had a number of sons. He actually killed a number of his sons because he worried that they were trying to supersede him later in his life. Herod was very paranoid. But these sons, so for example, Aristobulus was actually killed. But before he was killed, he and his wife, Herodias, had a son, Herod Agrippa I. We hear about Herod Agrippa I in Acts, and we hear about his son, Herod Agrippa II. So even though Aristobulus is killed because Herod gets worried that he's going to might lead a coup against him, later on his son, Herod's grandson, Herod Agrippa I, and Herod Agrippa II do become local client kings in the region. But we want to talk about Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip, because when Herod the Great dies, the Romans, because they really didn't like controlling or ruling an area directly, they'd rather have indirect rule, have a local person control the region, and they would simply prop up the client king. It was much more cost efficient to do it that way. And so Archelaus was given, as you can see from the map here, a substantial piece, all of Judea and even into Samaria, a substantial piece of Herod the Great's kingdom. Herod Antipas which is the Herod we mainly hear about in the Gospels during Jesus' ministry. He was given the Galilee and then part of this area to the east of the Jordan River, modern-day Jordan. And then there's Herod Philip, and Philip was given the area north of the Sea of Galilee, sort of north and also east of the Sea of Galilee. The Jordan River being the dividing line there between the two Herods, and which is really interesting because Jesus is kind of going back and forth between these two kingdoms in his ministry. Whenever he crosses the lake and goes over to the other side, he's going usually from Herod Antipas's territory into Herod Philip's territory. When he collects disciples from Bethsaida, well, that's in Herod Philip's territory. When he works in Capernaum, well, that's Herod Antipas's territory. And those are just, a couple miles apart. So we're talking about, Jesus' ministry in many cases being on the boundary line between Herod Philip and Herod Antipas's kingdoms. As I said, the Romans did not like to directly rule, preferred to have work through client kings, but Archelaus was so inept as a ruler that the Romans finally decided, forget it. They got rid of Archelaus in 6 CE or AD, all right, so during Jesus' life. And then they appoint the procurator, the Roman procurator or governor, who controls that area directly. So we, of course, know about this because of Pontius Pilate. He's the procurator. But notice that Pontius Pilate is not controlling the whole region. He's only controlling the part of the kingdom of Herod the Great that was given to Archelaus. Herod Antipas and Herod Philip, in some ways, are autonomous from Pontius Pilate. Here then is same kind of map. What's added to this is I point out the Decapolis cities, because we read about that in the Gospels too. You can see that in sort of the brown. The Decapolis cities that border and then also go, a little bit of it comes across the Jordan River, to Bet Shean and what have you. These are cities. The 10 cities, although there actually wasn't just 10, there was more than 10, but these are city-states that have their own autonomy. They're kind of a region that doesn't have one king, but rather each of these cities is giving some power and able to control the area around it. So it's sort of a league of cities, you could say. And we hear about Jesus traveling to the Decapolis regions too. So that's just sort of helpful. So there you go. This gives you sort of the political history of the time leading from the time of Alexander the Great's conquest to Jesus' ministry. Hopefully it gives you a context. We certainly will be talking more about these periods in time because they're so formative and have so much significance upon the ministry of Jesus.